When it came to non-competitive contracts, organizations often did not provide the justification. About 70% of the 97 contracts we looked at that were awarded to McKinsey & Company as non-competitive contracts. And their value was approximately $118 million. We also sampled and reviewed 33 contracts to assess value for money, and we found that almost half of the contracts lacked an explanation of what need or gap the contract was intended to address. In 15% of contracts, there was no clear statement of what the contract would deliver. And in 18% of contracts, there was no confirmation that the government had received all expected deliverables. As the central purchasing and contracting agent and subject matter expert for the Government of Canada, Public Services and Procurement Canada did not challenge organizations when awarding some contracts on their behalf. The department did not challenge the organizations requesting the contracts about whether the procurement strategy used was appropriate when multiple contracts were awarded to McKinsey & Company for a similar purpose and within a short period of time. Our single recommendation focused on the need for federal organizations to proactively address conflicts of interest in the procurement process. All other aspects of our findings were covered in recommendations recently made by other organizations, such as the Office of the Procurement Ombudsman and internal audit functions.
It focused on contracts awarded to McKinsey & Company. It highlights basic requirements and good practices that all federal organizations should follow when procuring professional services on behalf of the Government of Canada. Federal contracting and procurement policies exist to ensure fairness, transparency, and value for Canadians, but they only work if they are followed. The remedy isn't necessarily about creating new processes or rules, but rather about understanding how these processes and rules are applied and why often they are not. Monsieur le Président, je termine.
Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks, and we would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Hogan, we'll start Mrs. Cusi for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Madam Auditor General, for being here today along with your team, and thank you again for this report, which sheds even more light and I believe confirms even further the thoughts and ideas we had around contracting in the public service, both in adherence to the rules as well as a favoritism towards McKinsey. Madam Auditor General, last week I asked you to inform the Public Accounts Committee the date the 3 Canada Infrastructure Bank contracts were signed with McKinsey. Do you have those dates with you today?
I'm just going to turn to Nick, and he can provide that to you.
Thank you.
Yes, we do. Just give me a moment to pull it up.
It's your next question, or do you have it?
I have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
25th of January 2018, 30th of March 2018, and 19th of May 2020.
Okay, 19th of May 2020. Very interesting. Okay, thank you. Madam Auditor General, Mr. Dominic Barton chaired the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, which started in 2016. And shortly after, interestingly coinciding with these dates, we see a 2,500% increase from 2016 to 2023 in contracts awarded to McKinsey. In your opinion, is it a conflict of interest to have the global head of a company also chairing an economic advisory committee that helps determine the direction of a government?
I mean, that's a difficult question for me to answer. I'm not sure in what capacity he was providing advice as the chair of that committee, what his requirements were. So I unfortunately can't offer up an opinion on that.
Okay, thank you. I'll return to a theme I mentioned in my opening comment, favoritism in contracting. McKinsey received 2 contracts with IRCC for close to $25 million. And it's from these contracts and the Economic Advisory Council, chaired by Mr. Dominique Barton, that led to the infamous 500,000 immigration target that this government is now walking back from. How dangerous is it for a company to chair an advisory council that sets policy in an effort to help its own interests, would you say?
Again, I'm sorry, I don't know much about what that committee was doing, so it would be inappropriate for me to provide thoughts or opinions on it.
Okay, thank you. There were 4 instances in the competitive procurement process where your office found that the procurement strategy was changed after departments learned McKinsey could not bid under the original circumstances. And unfortunately, to no one's surprise, McKinsey won the bid under new criteria. Can a department call it a competitive process when they are changing the requirements to cater towards one specific company, in this case, McKinsey and Company?
So in the case of the 4 contracts that you're referring to, there were 2 where there was a change in strategy. And while the federal government is able to change its procurement approaches as it goes about, I would have expected to see a justification on file as to why they made such a switch. And then because 2 contracts were awarded in a non-competitive way, it clearly documenting why McKinsey would have been the only bidder or what exception was being used from the procurement rules to award a contract non-competitively. And as we mentioned, more than half of the contracts that we looked at that were awarded non-competitively did not have a good justification on file.
Thank you for that. Now, referring to your previous work on a Rive scam as well, since GC Strategies was allowed to sit at the table and negotiate the terms of its own contract as well, can you confirm, although I am hearing it in the response you gave to my last question, that this is happening frequently across departments? Would you say that this is happening frequently across departments?
I guess I want to draw a distinction between what we saw in ArriveCan and what we're seeing here. In ArriveCan, we clearly saw that GC Strategies was involved in setting the selection criteria. We did not see that in the McKinsey contracts. We saw that at times when there were competitive bids run, that the criteria, the selection criteria, weren't always used, but not that McKinsey had been involved in setting the selection criteria. So they're very different situations.
So then, given that, in your opinion, what specifically needs to be changed? What changes need to be made to ensure Canada's procurement processes are truly competitive?
When it comes to competitive contracts, what we found is that often there was, I think it was about more than a third of the time, the bid evaluation didn't have selection criteria that were clearly outlined, or when there were selection criteria, they weren't used. It's clear in the rules that you need to set out these criteria, and then you need to have a good evaluation grid and a committee put together. So again, to make this competitive process fair and transparent, the existing rules should have been applied.
Excellent. I'll end my time there, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Auditor General, again for the report and for being here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mrs. Kusi. Mr. Jouari, please, for 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Hogan, welcome back to you and your team. Thank you for the great work that you continue to do. I want to go back, and my understanding is you looked at a period of 1st of January 2011 to 7th of February of 2023. From a procedural point of view, it looks like there were a lot of procedures were not being followed. Was this consistent during this period? Were there any period that stood out more, not just because of the number, but from a procedural changes?
No, our conclusion that there was a frequent disregard for the rules was because it was across 9 departments and agencies and 10 crown corporations, but it was spread out over the 12-year period. So there isn't one year that sticks out more than other, except near the end where the National Master Standing Offer would have been used for 19 contracts, and in our view, the justification for using that was not well documented. That there would have been a slight spike there, but there still was a lack of following the rules across the whole 12-year period.
Okay, so lack of following the rules throughout the whole 12 years. Now, also, when we look at it, the difference between department, agencies, and Crown Corporation, did you see any difference between department, agencies, and Crown Corporation as far as following the procedures and making sure everything is well documented?
I mean, it's a tough one. There's 97 contracts, and I would tell you that almost each contract has its unique story with it. But when we looked at how frequent rules were not being followed, it didn't matter whether it was a Crown or a department or agency. It's important to note that the Crown corporations had their own rules. They don't usually follow the Treasury Board rules. But there was still a frequent disregard for not following them. Again, the most being really not documenting why a non-competitive process.
So thank you. And that was a very important point. Crown Corporation have their own policies, procedures, systems, and they're not following TBS's, whereas the department and agencies do. And there was still this common disregard, not only across the years, but even across between the Crown corporations as well as the department and agencies. Now, I want to go back to where you nearly closed, and you said the remedy, and you've made recommendation, and thank you for the recommendations that you've made. You pointed us back to a number of previous recommendations, and you basically said, just go and do it. And these are the newer recommendations, and you've made two, which kept very clear focus on what we should do, what the government should do. Now, looking at your nearly closing statement, you said the remedy isn't necessarily about creating new processes or rules, but rather about understanding how these processes and rules are applied and why often they're not. Can you expand on that one?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think over time, whenever there's an audit done, whether it be by an internal audit department, the Comptroller General's office, the Procurement Ombuds, or my office, the tendency is to add more rules. And I think here the case was not that there were rules that were missing, except for conflict of interest, which is why we issued one there. But that the rules just need to be followed. And I think it's important for the federal government to sit back and try and assess why this is happening. What is it about the procurement rules that are driving the behavior that we're seeing? There are many reasons that could be there. Is it that the rules are so complex in order to speed up the procurement process? People are working around the rules? Is it that there are so many rules that they don't know them all and are accidentally not applying it? Or is there some other behavior that is driving what we're seeing? Because it's clear that the rules are there to ensure fairness, transparency, and accountability and delivering value for money. It's just they're not being followed.
So thank you. That was a great coverage with can you tell me, in your opinion, do you think those rules, because I'm sure you've looked at it, do you think those rules are complicated? Because you're clearly saying, let's not add more rules to it, which we really support, because we are doing a study, and my colleagues are going to follow up on that. But do you think our rules are complicated?
I think there are a lot of rules, and at times they can be complicated. And I think there was a recent announcement by the Treasury Board about adding certain certifications around procurement processes, and I appreciate that additional layer that was added. It wasn't about adding a rule, but about reminding people to certify that they have done certain things in the rules. I would tell you there is some confusion. If we look at the National Master Standing Offer, I think most organizations believed that because they had to use the standing offer, that they could just pull off of it. But what's clear is that is just an offer of goods and services. It isn't a contract. So when you create a contract that is done in a non-competitive way, the rules kick in that say you should justify why. And often that justification was lacking. So I think there it was that folks didn't understand necessarily what the rules were. So I think it's a bit of both. There's a lot, they're complex, and they're not always easy to follow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jory. Mrs. Vignola, please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Hogan, gentlemen, welcome. Mackenzie is a small player in Canada, but a big international player and has the power to influence and pull strings. Now, out of 349,000 civil servants, do you think there are many people who used to work for McKinsey? I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I didn't look into the numbers of civil servants previously working for McKinsey. Well, who would be able to figure that out? And would it be a conflict of interest? Well, I don't know who would be able to do that. Perhaps Treasury Board? But perhaps I'd draw your attention to one of our observations, and that is that an assessment of conflict of interest is very important during the procurement process. So statements of conflicts of interest are done yearly by ourselves, but not necessarily every time there is a contract. That's why I think that a statement of conflict of interest is required and should be required whenever there is contracting. There are several factors that really did surprise me when I was reading your report, which is excellent in passing. Congratulations to your entire team. I noticed that in 45% of the cases that you looked at, so you didn't look at all of them, you looked at a sample, people don't know what they want, they don't know if it's necessary, they don't know if they got what they wanted, and they don't even know if they met their goals. This is quite frightening. And it makes me wonder about how long this has been happening, how long these kinds of contracts have been happening, and how long their value has lasted. Do you have the same kinds of questions? Well, sometimes I do. I think it truly depends on the goal of the contract. Now, if you look at these contracts, they were for example, benchmarking. They were to support transformation and change. Sometimes it was to provide professional advice. So it's difficult to assess. You're not creating something tangible like an application. You're requesting expert advice. So sometimes it's difficult to assess whether those deliverables happened. But there are some basic things that should have happened. What is the need you're trying to address? That would be one good question. Half of the contracts we looked at approximately did not have that kind of supporting document. And there should be a proactive assessment of the costs to be able to set a budget. In 91% of the contracts, that kind of assessment or estimate didn't happen. So these are basic things that should happen. And so ultimately, if in 20% of contracts, if those deliverables haven't happened, well, yes, that does raise questions. But I think this starts from the very beginning. So you're saying that from the outset there are problems. In one of my former lives, I was a coordinator under a strategy program for underprivileged areas. And there was no program that could be done. There was no funding that could happen unless you had an assessment. And what you're telling me here is that from the outset, people don't know what they want. But then in terms of the analyses and the needs, there's no actual guarantee that the need will be addressed over time. So do you think that over time there's this memory loss about the ability to benchmark within these organizations and an ability to identify that need before you go outside? Well, I think what's very important is to identify why you need that contract. And if you don't, then you have catch up to do. So let's say that you have a transformation project. There are oftentimes contracts that are awarded to help the government figure out how it can undertake that transformation. So you need to go for outside advice. It's human nature to always want to do things the same way. So sometimes it does take someone from the outside to help. But what I would expect is that there be a report, that there be something to show what that added value is. I remember hearing here once someone who made fun of a public servant saying that it was surprising that they had ideas and that their ideas had been used. So sometimes it's true that you need new eyes. You need a view from the outside to see what can be improved. And oftentimes our internal resources are underused, but they're also ridiculed. You know, it's just assumed that public servants don't have the job to think. Do you think that would be a mentality that has to change? Do you think sometimes some of the upper levels should go and sit down in the cafeteria with these employees? Well, I would say that our own office is going through a transformation and looking at how we work, looking at how to work more effectively. And I saw some resistance to change. I did hire some people from the outside to come and bring their perspective. And as soon as there is openness to new ideas, well, then you come up with all kinds of other ideas. So I think that there are many people within the public service who have good ideas.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Hogan, for being back with the committee to share your work. Some disturbing findings for sure, and I think the questions that my colleagues have already asked start to get at the nub of what we're trying to figure out as a committee. In my view, there are two theses here. One is that the government is tight with McKinsey and so is showing favoritism towards one vendor. The other thesis is that there's a perception within the public service that the rules are overly restrictive, and in order to get things done, they have to break the rules. And I'm wondering which of those, in your view, is more likely to be the dominant contributing factor in what we're seeing?
Well, I think in some of our findings, we did find that there were 6 contracts that seemed to be designed to suit McKinsey and Company, whether it was organizations waiting for them to have their own national master standing offer so that they could use them for benchmarking services when there were other existing standing offers with benchmarking services, or just changing their procurement strategy, as we talked about earlier on. So we saw that in 6 contracts, but what's more concerning for me is the frequent disregard for the rules, right? There were, when we looked at a sample, I would have said there's probably, more than half where it was more than one rule that wasn't followed. So it isn't that we just highlighted it when it was one rule. So this just points to, I think, both things working, whether there might be sometimes a tendency to look for a vendor, but there is clearly a tendency to not apply all of the rules. And we need to figure out why in the public service that is happening.
Do you expect that we would see the same pattern if your investigation was broadened to include other vendors?
Based on the findings here, because there were only 6 contracts that appeared to suit McKinsey, I have no reason to believe that this is unique to McKinsey and Company. I would expect that we would see similar behaviors for other professional services and other contracts in general. When you add on the layer that it was 8 out of 10 departments and agencies, 9 out of 10 departments and agencies, and 8 out of 10 Crown corporations where we had issues with the rules being followed. That is a wide range, so it can't just be limited to McKinsey.
Now, I'm curious, in the course of your work, did you speak with the people in charge of these procurements, and did you ask them why they seem to be flagrantly breaking the rules that govern their work? Did they provide an explanation?
Well, we typically review files and then speak to individuals. The degree to which we communicated, I'll have to turn to Nick and see how much he engaged, but we would have engaged with every single of the 20 organizations.
Did you ask them why?
We certainly spoke to the organizations, bearing in mind the time frame for the contracts. In most cases, the individuals responsible were not in that role anymore. But I think, Ms. Hogan made a mention earlier about, particularly around the NMSO, a lot of confusion about how the rules were supposed to be applied in that case that came through in the conversations that we had.
People in charge of procurement were confused as to the rules that they were required to follow?
That's right.
If the committee wanted to understand the motivations or the reasons behind this what seems like flagrant breaking of the rules, who would we talk to?
Who would you talk to in each of the organizations, or just in general?
We can bring anyone before committee and ask them what they were thinking when they broke all the rules to give work to McKinsey. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out who that is.
Well, I think it depends where you're going. I would tell you that deputy heads and heads of crowns of corporations should be able to answer questions about all procurement within their organization, even though they were not the ones actually signing the contracts. But it would be either CFOs, individuals in procurement groups. I mean, there are many layers. I guess it depends what you're looking for, and recognizing, as Nick mentioned, this was over a 12-year period. People move around a lot in the public service, and if you're looking for the specific individual, you just might not find them.
Would one way to test this thesis be to simply expand this work slightly to include a broader sample of vendors and look at whether the same patterns occur?
Well, I think that would be one choice. What I would also think is a good option is that we've also encouraged all departments and agencies and crowns to improve their compliance and quality control around procurement. I think it's time to give the public service a chance to recognize and refresh all of the rules and then go back and look, because I believe, as I said, I have no reason to believe that my results would be any differently if I expanded this.
And how about accountability? Like, what's at stake here is value for money. This is Canadians' money. It's being spent poorly. There's one company that's enriching itself to the tune of, millions and millions of dollars. There are individuals that make a decision to break the rules, and whether they know the rules exist or not, there's still some culpability there. How do we ensure that people are held accountable, and where does accountability ultimately fall in this place?
You have about 5 seconds for an answer.
I've said it before. I think ultimately accountability rests with the deputy head or the head of a crown corporation to make sure that all of their contracting provides value for money.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Backrath. Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome back to our committee, Ms. Hogan, and to your departmental officials. In your audit, you found multiple instances of favoritism being shown to McKinsey. In one instance, the Business Development Bank of Canada gave a contract to McKinsey, despite McKinsey not being the highest scoring bid. They also gave 2 sole source contracts without documenting their justification, and my colleague mentioned that in her intervention. And the Canada Border Services Agency had 3 contracts missing bid evaluation documents, and Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada had 2 contracts missing bid evaluation documents. And as my colleagues have been pointing out around the table this morning, we see repeated abuses of the procurement system with seemingly no checks and balances in place from the government. And it would appear no concern or pushback as well. If the exception becomes the rule, then I believe this becomes the culture, and that we have a huge problem within the government. How is this allowed to happen with no consequences for those who are failing to follow the rules?
I do agree that when 70% of the contracts awarded were done so in a non-competitive way, it raises concern. Non-competition should be the default. Competition ensures that you hopefully get a better price for taxpayers. I guess that doesn't always mean that it is the lowest bidder. There could be business reasons that you might choose a different bidder. But again, I would expect that kind of a judgment call is well supported and documented. I think often that's what we're missing here, is that the rules aren't being followed, and then there is no demonstration for what business decision drove that. And I would really like to see everyone across the federal government sort of have more rigor in their procurement processes. This isn't a big burden that we're asking. It is about just being transparent and being able to answer to Canadians 10 or 12 years down the line why a decision was made. And it starts with understanding the rules and then documenting all of the judgment calls that are made along the way.
I want to confirm what I believe I heard you say in regards to accountability, and that there needs to be accountability within a department, regardless of whether a department head, a deputy minister, an assistant deputy minister, any one of those individuals were involved in the procurement, that they need to be held accountable for decisions that are made within their department and when rules are not being followed. Is that what I heard you say?
I believe that Andrew's going to want to jump in here, but I think I would start off by saying that legislation makes it clear that the deputy head's the accounting officer of an organization, and while you might delegate those powers to others in the organization for day-to-day to happen, because, for example, I couldn't review every single contract that my office issues, but you still have to make sure that people are properly trained, they understand the rules, and there's good compliance and overview. So I don't know, Andrew, if you want to add something?
The only thing I would add is that we stressed in our ArriveCan report the importance of delegated decision makers understanding and being accountable for the decisions that they make to spend public money. So as much as the deputy head is the responsible person to answer and be accountable here at committee and before Parliament, there is an accountability all the way through the organization that should be enforced.
And I'm not sure how much time I have, but I would ask, does being moved out of a position sever the responsibility that you might hold when you were in that position making decisions?
I mean, my view is not. I would expect, however, that you left a really good file behind to demonstrate the judgment calls and the decisions that you made. People's memories are going to fail, and so it's important to make sure you document something when you're going through it.
Thanks very much. Mr. Kuzmirchuk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Ms. Hogan, to you and your team and the entire Auditor General team for your incredibly important work that you're bringing forward for Canadians and to this committee. So thank you so much. All of us are seeking stronger and better accountability. I wanted to ask you, there were 97 contracts that you looked at, 10 departments, and also 10 arm's-length Crown agencies. There is a variation in terms of the degree of non-compliance that you found. Are there departments that scored better or scored well or had even a clean bill of health in your review? And if there is, what does that tell you about some of the challenges that we're facing here, if some departments actually did okay?
I'm going to ask Nick or Stephen to pull out the one. As I mentioned, there was 9 out of 10 departments and agencies that did not follow the rules when it came to procurement. So we'll get you the name of the one. But even there, we have to recognize that at times they did, right? And so I think that's what speaks to the need to refresh and remind everyone of the rules. And I would expect that it's not just training, but that there would then be a monitoring and an oversight and compliance that happens after the fact. An individual might only do one contract every couple of years, and you can't be expected to remember all of the rules. So I think it's important to do that refresh. Nick, do you have name. I tried to speak long enough so that you
Yes,
can
so
have
I
me.
got that. Yeah, Natural Resources Canada was the organization, the federal department and agency where we found that they had followed the rules. I think the other thing to bear in mind is the number of contracts, which in some cases there were more, which increases your risk of missing a rule.
Okay, no, gotcha. I did want to ask a question. Inside your report, you talked about the chains of non-competitive contracts. Can you explain the what that means, the chains of non-competitive contracts, and what are the risks specifically to these chains of contracts?
So I think I just want to be clear that that's a word we described. We didn't know a better way to describe what we were seeing. It isn't a term commonly used. For me, what it shows is that if you issue the first contract in a competitive way and then issue subsequent contracts in a non-competitive way, you're limiting competition. And as I said, the default of competition to drive better value for money is important. More concerning is the chain of contracts where the first contract is a small contract that called on an exception under the contracting rules, that if it's under a certain dollar threshold, there was no need for competition, it wouldn't provide better value for money. But then to use the subsequent exception for the follow-on contracts that were of a larger dollar value in the millions of dollars, again, starts to question, did you not think at the beginning what your need was that you needed to fill? It comes down to that fundamental starting question, but constantly says, well, are you then more dependent or creating a dependency on a vendor if you're issuing multiple non-competitive contracts, and how are you ensuring best value for money if none of them are being competed? So I think it brings in so many rules when we see the chains, which just raised a lot of concerns for us.
Any of the 97 contracts that you looked at, did you see any political interference in any of the 97 contracts? So interference from elected officials or politicians?
So no, we did not see political interference in the contracts that we looked at. We did see that a minister was involved in one procurement because it was a non-competitive procurement above the threshold that public services allowed to issue on their own. So in accordance with the rules, they went to the minister authorized it, and then the government issued the contract as they normally would have through their regular processes.
Were politicians, elected officials driving the decisions to offer these contracts to this vendor or any vendor that you saw? Were they the drivers?
We did not see that there was a push from a political aspect to direct any contracts to McKinsey.
These decisions were made by public servants, by public officials or bureaucrats, as they're often called. Is that correct?
Correct. The decisions that we saw were made by public servants. Even in the 6 contracts that appeared to be designed to suit McKinsey and Company, it was the public service that made those decisions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kuzmierczak. Mrs. Vignola, please, for 2.5.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Hogan, I'd like to come back to the duty to do an in-depth review. So there is an opportunity to ask questions about contracts, that is to say PSPC. Can they challenge any decisions about contracts, and do they have the ability to make sure that all stages of the process have gone through, and if they haven't, then can they require that those steps be followed before the contract is awarded? Well, the responsibility of PSPC is to challenge the tool being used for procurement. Oftentimes, we saw that they didn't challenge. For example, in cases where there were several contracts awarded over a short period of time. But I think also, ultimately, it is the department requesting the service that has the last say, even though PSPC can challenge the decision. Now, when there are these chains of contracts that we've seen, if the contract is below a threshold, then PSPC wouldn't be aware. The only way that it would be made aware of the contract is if the department were to tell them. So they have the power to challenge, but ultimately, it doesn't really mean anything that the department has the last word. Well, if that contract is awarded individually by another department, yes. Now, this word benchmarking has come up. In other words, there's a decision to go with a certain provider because they are experts in that type of analysis. Now, over 160 years, have these kinds of tools not been developed? Do we not have the ability to have these benchmarking services? That is to say, our own tools, our own services? Can we not have those best practices and that ability to identify best practices? Well, there are organizations within the private sector who are specialists in benchmarking. I think the public service has this kind of information. For example, take Statistics Canada, but oftentimes what is needed is that outside information, that outside perspective to understand what the private sector is doing and to compare it to the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to ask a similar question to my colleague around the role of PSPC. It seems possibly defensible that some people within specific departments might not be familiar with all of the procurement rules, but you would think that the department that is solely responsible for procurement would know all of the rules and would be able to challenge the departments when they see those rules being flagrantly broken. Like, is PSPC not living up to its purported reason for being? Like, this is the whole model that we have, and it doesn't seem to be working.
So I mean, we did find in this audit that they could have done a better job at challenging many of the organizations, especially when there was multiple contracts that appeared to be issued for similar work in a really short period of time. But there are things that they're not aware of. So I am, as I mentioned earlier, if a contract's issued below a dollar value threshold, it's only the department that issued that contract would be aware of it. There is no big central repository for all of that information. But when it comes to the National Master Standing Offer, let's look at that, for example. I believe the Deputy Minister has been before committee before, testifying on how she didn't believe that the call-ups required a documentation. I think I had a very lengthy conversation with her about, but the National Master Standing Offer is just an offer. It's not the contract. So when the contract happens, it should be required. I think following the Procurement Ombud's work, she actually changed the requirements and now is reminding every department that they should provide that justification. So I think this is a learning opportunity as certain tools are used more often, that rigor needs to be put into documenting decisions.
How many seconds, Mr. Chair?
35.
Okay. It seems, coming back to McKinsey, it seems like sometimes you end up with this bias in organizations towards vendors that are either the biggest or have the most high-profile reputation because it's seen as the safest option. That if something goes wrong, nobody can blame them for choosing such a reputable, high-profile firm, as opposed to an upstart, one with less of a reputation, one that has less profile. Is that something that you see in procurement decision-making, that there's a bias towards higher-profile firms because it's seen as being the safest choice?
Very brief answer, please.
I'm not sure that I can say that we saw that in these 97 contracts. I think I would call into question the National Master Standing Offer. They existed with other organizations as well for benchmarking services. So there were other companies at the disposal of departments, and I would have expected that they would have documented why McKinsey over the other National Master Standing Offer companies.
Thanks very much. Mr. Genuis for 5, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we're here looking at the government's cozy relationship with McKinsey, and thank you again to the Auditor General for your excellent work exposing significant problems, $200 million in contracts that have gone to McKinsey under this government, most of which in some way or another did not adhere to the rules. You've just mentioned the important role that PSPC, the government's contracting department, is supposed to play, could have played, challenging some of these procurements. In that light, I think it's interesting to note that the Director of Policy to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, Mr. Boyan, Gerasimov, he had this critical role of director of policy in the Minister of Public Services and Procurement's office during the critical period of the pandemic from March 2020 until December 2021. He is McKinsey alum. He served with McKinsey for more than 5 years as an engagement manager, went from working with McKinsey into this Liberal government in an important senior staff role. His LinkedIn specifically cites work he did in relation to major defense equipment procurements. So you have former McKinsey in this critical role in government procurement in the Minister of Procurement's office under then Minister Anita Anand, a former McKinsey employee, and you've highlighted that the government's contracting department that he was working for could have provided a greater challenge function, and they didn't. And we've also seen how the Defense Department in particular had a very close, extensive relationship with McKinsey. So this is quite concerning to me, and it underlines the close relationships that exist between McKinsey and this Liberal government. I wonder if you could share a bit more about what role the minister's office did play or could have played, providing a challenge function around this extensive procurement relationship that emerged, and what conclusions we might be able to draw about the role that the Director of Policy in Minister Anand's office should have been playing, could have been playing, did play in relation to these procurements.
So typically I would not expect ministers to be involved at all in procurement decisions that are made by departments. And when we looked at these 97 contracts, we did not see ministerial involvement except for one where it was required by the rules. I would expect that PSPC would do a better challenge function in some of these contracts. In other areas, we saw that they did do a good challenge function. I think ultimately it boils down to making sure that everyone who's involved in the procurement process understands the rules and applies them in a way to ensure fairness, transparency, and good value for money for Canadians.
So the function of the minister's office is to set a policy framework, and the director of policy plays a key role in that. You're saying you wouldn't want to see them involved in kind of micro procurement decisions, but I guess for them to have a function at all, presumably it's to set that policy framework in which says how sharply they're going to exercise that challenge function or not. And there clearly were failures to challenge McKinsey procurement in cases where it should have been challenged from that department. Is that correct?
For sure. I think that PSPC should have done a better job at challenging some of the procurements that were brought to them for them to be able to issue contracts. But I would expect that challenge function also exists in every department and agency, because not all contracts go through PSPC in order to be issued.
Right. No, and I think there are problems in other places for sure, but it stuck out to me that this particular person, Boyan Gerasimov, was the director of policy to the Minister of Procurement in the middle of the pandemic, and that he is a McKinsey alum. Madam Auditor, just in the time I have left, I note in your report 45% of the contracts examined lacked sufficient documentation to justify the need for a contract. So in almost half of the cases of these contracts, there wasn't even evidence or sufficient evidence that there was any reason for the contract to happen in the first place, which is quite staggering in light of $200 million in contracts. Anything more you can share about that 45% figure and what it reveals?
Well, for me, it reveals that at the start, everyone should be taking a step back before they enter into a procurement process. You need to figure out if you are trying to fill a skills gap that doesn't exist in the public service, whether you need additional resources, or if you're just trying to get, plurality of thought and trying to get something outside the public service to compare to. Once you've justified that, then you make an estimate for what you think you're willing to spend for that. Those are all requirements that are in the procurement policies that exist now, and then go out and get a contract. I would expect that the default would be competitive unless there's a justification for non-competitive.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baines, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madam Auditor General, and your team for this major undertaking. And I've had the opportunity to we have here in this committee and other committees look at a number of contracts and the vast expansive of contracts that are out there and how they're looked at, how they're done, and we've had the opportunity to go back as far as 20 years. Some witnesses have indicated that the procurement process hasn't really changed much. And then there's also the issue of, I think in some of your findings, where there's a lot of familiarity amongst contractors, subcontractors, and it may be something that has become practice where, the familiarity may be a reason why things are overlooked. It's some things that we've seen. And there's been and you've mentioned there's a frequent disregard of rules applied, and that may be some of it because of that. So my question is, you also talked about people moving around, changing of roles is very frequent, and there can be gaps there. And then, is the work being passed along to some other people that are just coming into picking up a file and then saying, and not knowing what processes have been gone through and how do you verify those kinds of things? So I'm just looking at all of those challenges that can happen in such a huge departmental responsibilities that do occur. So I think PC, with the question around PSPC suspending departments and agencies' delegated authority for professional services contracts in November of last year, while new procedures and training were put in place, I'm not sure you have had a chance to evaluate these measures yet. But when do you believe we will get a sense of whether those are working, those new measures that have been put in place?
I mean, I think you've raised other possibilities for why the behavior that we're seeing might be happening, and I think that's why the public service needs to take a step back and figure out what it is about procurement rules that are driving the behaviors that we're seeing. The changes that were brought about after the audit period, I have not had an opportunity to look at. I believe removing the delegated authority of a department is one way to ensure that Public Service and Procurement Canada can play a bigger a challenge function and a more important role in that department's procurement strategy. So I would expect that they would be able to comment on how quickly they will see improvements or changes with the new rules that are there. I think the one rule that I really appreciate is where someone in charge of a procurement will have to certify that they've done certain key steps. For me, that's the great reminder that is needed about the existing rules and how they should be applied.
Okay, when it comes to the now defunct National Master Standing Offer mechanism, the government's working on a replacement for that. What are some of the characteristics you would hope to see in there?
Well, if you look back to what a National Master Standing Offer is meant for, it's meant to provide a group of services that are commonly purchased in a certain format. I guess I would call it almost like a vending machine, right? There's certain things you can get and you decide how often you want or how many you want of one item. I would expect that a National Master Standing Offer list would be created through a competitive process instead of a non-competitive process. While both are allowed under the existing rules, I always default to competition should bring about the best value for Canadians, and when possible, that process should be run in that way. So I would like to see that. I would then hope that PSPC would ensure that none of the call-ups against those National Master Standing Offers would include services outside of the ones that are allowed for under the offer.
Okay, and you indicated that you didn't see any political interference in these decisions, and the ultimate responsibility should lie with the deputy heads of each department. And so how can government simplify the process to provide accountability and also streamline the process?
I think as Andrew responded before in expanding the answer, a deputy head is ultimately, through legislation, the accounting officer of an organization and are ultimately accountable for all of the decisions that are made. That is delegated down through the organization. Everyone who has delegated authority has training to do about what it means. And I think everyone needs to recognize that signing off or committing the government to to a contract, signing off on the use of public funds comes with accountability. So it does have to be a culture throughout the organization, every organization, about making sure that there's prudent use of public funds.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brock, please.
And thank you, Auditor General, for your attendance and your team as well. I'm going to preface my questions with a comment. And since you released your reports, three reports last week, I've heard from hundreds of Canadians who have expressed their profound disappointment in this NDP Liberal government that over the course of almost 9 years consistently demonstrate a lack of adherence to basic procurement rules. And to your point in this particular audit is you focus in on whether or not procurement, in this case to McKinsey, provided value for money for Canadians. And I take a look at your overall message, and you indicate quite clearly that federal contracting and procurement policies exist to ensure fairness, transparency, and value for Canadians, but they only work if they are followed. So I'm hearing that, yes, the auditor is making recommendations, and the department heads and organizations are saying, yes, we'll agree to follow those recommendations. But they already know what the rules are, and they're not following it. And every audit that I have been privy to from your office consistently shows a pattern of disrespect for taxpayer monies. So the question to you is, how do you define value for money from an auditor's perspective?
So that's not always a simple question to answer. In this case, we did outline in our audit report, I'm just trying to find the paragraph for you, it's paragraph 28, where we listed elements that we were searching for to demonstrate value for money. I would have told you that value for money during the pandemic might have been evaluated in a slightly different way than it should be evaluated in the normal course of business. But we would have expected that departments would have clearly articulated the need for a contract, what the expected deliverables were, whether all the deliverables had been provided, and whether or not the ultimate intent of that contract, so the outcome, was achieved. So we more than half, one or more of those, we could not see being demonstrated.
The Government of Canada has published on its website that it must adhere to 4 fundamental principles of financial management. 1, value for money. 2, accountability. 3, transparency. And 4, risk management. Government of Canada defines value for money as follows: that public funds, taxpayer monies, are managed with prudence and probity. Assets are safeguarded and resources are used effectively, efficiently, and economically to achieve departmental and governmental objectives. A very specific definition. So, I know that you've indicated last week that your mandate, and you've indicated this numerous times, your mandate is also to refer criminality, should you suspect criminality, to the appropriate authorities. And I believe you indicated when a question was put to you whether you discovered any element of criminality. I want to confirm a couple of things. Your threshold for referrals is based on suspicion and suspicion only. Is that correct?
I mean, it is very rare that we would refer something to the RCMP or to law enforcement before our work is made public. But we're always happy to talk to the RCMP once it's out there. But we have not made a referral in this case.
Do you agree that the Government of Canada holds its position as a trustee over public funds? Do you agree with that statement?
That it holds its position?
That it performs the role as a trustee over public funds. Do you agree with that statement?
I agree that it should be using public funds in a way that brings the best value to Canadians. Okay. Absolutely.
You don't agree that they hold a trust relationship with Canadians?
Well, absolutely. Every individual should trust its government.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Which brings me to a potential criminal charge of breach of trust under Section 336 of the Criminal Code. a straight indictable offense punishable by a maximum of 14 years. The elements are there that potentially someone who made the decision to favor McKinsey on a broad range of departments and Crown corporations could be held liable for the actions that they took. So, did you direct your mind at all to the potential that there should be a breach of trust investigation by appropriate law enforcement?
Very brief answer.
Given the origin of this audit, we were looking for whether or not there was direction or political interference. We did not see it in this audit. If there was a concern around improper use of public funds in a way that could have been criminal, we would have referred it to the RCMP.
I'm afraid that is our
Position of
time, Mr.
authority,
Brock.
though?
That is our time, I'm afraid. Mr. Kuzmirchuk?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and just to along those same lines of what my colleague had stated, we are absolutely always concerned about making sure that public funds are used appropriately, which is why we were so disappointed that the Conservative Party was using tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of public funds for political events to pay for the travel of themselves and their spouses to political caucuses, which everyone knows is absolutely wrong. So I just wanted to get that on the record. Ms. Hogan, we know how important the independence of your office is to do your work. And we know that it's important. This allows your work to move forward unimpeded. Last week, the Conservatives put forward a motion requiring your office to produce documents in your possession. And so I wanted to ask you, how does ordering your office to do this impact your ability to fulfill your mandate and conduct your audits?
So I believe that the member, Mr. Chair, is referring to the motion in the House that is, I think, being voted on later on today. In my view, in my opinion, including my office in that motion was unnecessary. I made it clear last week that I would cooperate with the RCMP if they felt it necessary to come to my office and ask for information. We have a well-established procedure that has worked effectively in the past, which includes them providing me with a production order should they want to have access to my files. I believe that the motion does impede on my independence in that I don't need to go through the law clerk. I have a proven track record that I am cooperative and supportive with parliamentarians, and that I would cooperate very swiftly with the RCMP if the need arose.
I very much appreciate your response, and Madam Auditor General, I just wanted to say, all of us here on this side of the table so appreciate your work. We trust the work that you do. It's very important. And I wanted to say thank you for your time here today at committee. We are listening very attentively to what you are bringing forward here. Unfortunately, my conservative colleague across the way is tweeting on social media as we speak while you are giving your testimony here, which I think shows you just how seriously or unseriously they're taking your testimony here today. I wanted to ask you as well, Madam Auditor General, you mentioned the fact that you looked at 97 contracts. 97 contracts. You only found one contract where there was any ministerial involvement, and that's simply because the value of the contract exceeded a certain threshold. What percentage of the contracts you looked at had zero ministerial or political involvement? What percentage?
Well, if it's 1 out of 97, not a calculator, but I'm going to go with almost 99% of those contracts did not involve ministerial interference.
That is 99% did not have any ministerial involvement. I really do appreciate you providing that information for us, and I do hope that information makes it to my conservative colleagues' social media platform, because that is important information to know. Also wanted to ask you, why do some, because you talked about what is driving the behavior of public officials, public servants, why do some public officials keep going back to the same well? in terms of a certain company or a certain contract?
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. I think we saw in some of the contracts that we reviewed that they felt that once one contract had been issued, there was McKinsey had a knowledge of the business that then would justify that they would be more efficient and effective in future contracts. But I think that could be said about any vendor, which is why I do believe that the first requirement to determine exactly what you're hoping to accomplish with a procurement process is well thought through, well documented, and then you pick the most appropriate tool that is available. Sometimes they are competitive and sometimes they are not in order to accomplish that outcome.
And you mentioned the fact that Natural Resources Department was one of the departments that had a clean bill of health. Are you able to provide us, what did they do well? I mean, we looked at, in your report, you talked about what the other departments did not do so well. Do we know what Natural Resources did well?
Well, I'm going to give a really quick answer and see if Nick wants to add, but I would say follow the rules well.
That was my answer, AG. Mr. Swells, if you have a brief response.
I have nothing specific to add beyond that. That was what they did.
Okay, great. We'll go to Mrs. Vignola.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Hogan, I'd like to come back to something you were saying earlier. You spoke about benchmarking and said that sometimes you need people from the private sector to provide that comparative analysis, that benchmarking. Now, out of the 349,000 public servants we have, there are many who have come from the private sector. Why wouldn't you call on their expertise? Why wouldn't one call upon their expertise? That's my first question. My second question is this. You also stated that we have a perfect opportunity to learn, but this isn't the first report that you have done and that others have done on procurement. And Canada hasn't been awarding contracts only recently. So how is it that over the years, over the decades, Canada hasn't figured out how to solve these recurring procurement problems in terms of supporting documents, justifying each stage? So I'm really flabbergasted that after all this time and after all this experience, we're still at the point where decisions are not being supported. Can you explain that? Well, I'm a little perplexed as well, because it seems to me that these are basic rules that should be followed when it comes to contracting. Your first question had to do with why we're not relying on expertise within the public service. And I really think that this would be a question that would have to be asked of each department, each Crown corporation, because some do this well and some don't do it as well. I mean, if you look at those 97 contracts that were awarded, well, that doesn't necessarily give a complete picture of the entire government for every and each decision. In my opinion, there are several rules, and there's also a turnover of employees. So there has to be ongoing training. I know we do this within our office, but if an individual is going to award a contract or is going to be responsible for awarding contracts, then if it's not something they do on a daily basis, they should have that training. Because the reflex should be to go back to those basic rules and follow them.
Mr. Bachrach, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, in the 4 of the 28 contracts in which the process appeared to be designed and implemented to favor McKinsey, I'm wondering if your office could provide the committee with some direction as to who we might call before the committee to ask about the reasons for those decisions.
I guess we could give you the names of the departments that were involved in those, and then
like it requires a bit of forensic work on our part to figure out which individuals were actually involved. And I think getting to the bottom of the motivation is really a key step in order to fix it. Are all four of them McKinsey alum? Do any of the four of them actually understand the rules that they were supposed to be following? Like, these are all questions that I think are probably relevant to trying to fix plug the hole in the ship. Is that information that your office can provide?
Well, Mr. Chair, we can provide the departments involved in those four contracts and the dates of those four contracts. I think one of my previous comments where there are 97 here and there's probably 97 unique differences, and I think that's something to bear in mind as you go through this. Every contract has some uniqueness or some story around it. Yeah.
Right. And then your comment about having a checklist, essentially, to have each individual who's responsible for the procurement process go through a checklist and make an attestation that they followed all the required steps. Like, it seems like such a simple fix. And I find it a bit bewildering that these are individuals, some of whom are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure that the public gets value for money and that all the rules are followed, and they need a checklist to make sure that they didn't skip any steps. And it seems like they're not even aware the steps exist. If the fix is so simple as a simple checklist, why wasn't this done years and years ago?
Well, the comment I made is one that actually was just implemented, I believe, by Public Service and Procurement Canada, or from Treasury Board. It was actually from Treasury Board. It was an announcement that those were some of the strengths brought to the procurement process. And I think that just reflects on the complexity of all of the rules that exist. There are many. It's not just Treasury Board policies. There's trade agreements. There are so many things that need to be factored in to a procurement process. That it does require at times, I think, a bit of an aide-mémoire, especially if it's not something that you do every day. And that's why I would encourage every organization to make sure they involve their own procurement branch, in addition to Public Service and Procurement Canada if needed.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Hogan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hogan. Ms. Cusi, you have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Chair.
I'm going to go back to the National Master Standing Offers. So a National Master Standing Offer was granted to McKinsey in 2021 in a non-competitive process. This was not properly justified and ended up costing a total of $42.4 million. The call-ups issued under the unjustified offer were also unjustified. How does the justification process need to be reformed to ensure competitive processes are honored?
I think one point to clarify here is that the National Master Standing Offer was done in a non-competitive way. While Public Service and Procurement Canada provided a justification, we felt it was rather weak. Then the next step is where I think confusion existed when there were 19 call-ups against the National Master Standing Offer. I think the organizations felt that they were using a procurement vehicle that was at their disposal and that they didn't need to justify why they were using that vehicle. But when you realize that that is the first time a contract is being issued between the government and McKinsey, the non-competitive contracting rules kick in, and there should have been a well-documented rationale for why that National Master Standing Offer versus another.
In your opinion, why do you think some departments are capable of contracting according to government standards, but Procurement Canada, the body in charge of procurement, seems to struggle in this area?
I think Public Service and Procurement Canada issue many contracts. They were not involved in all 97 here, but what we found is that they could have done a better job challenging. And I think that's one of the big questions that the public service needs to ask itself is, what is it about the rules that's causing this behavior? Because the rules, in my view, are rather clear. While there are many, they are rather clear.
Clearly, it's the government. Why was a minister's signature required for a $5 million contract, but not any of the other of the massive contracts, that were granted to McKinsey?
In the case where the minister was involved, the contract was being issued on a non-competitive basis, and there's a certain threshold that the public service can no longer authorize a non-competitive contract. I think it's $4.5 million. And that's why a minister needed to be involved, because it was non-competitive versus competitive.
The justification provided was challenged by procurement officials before the minister signed off and agreed to the call-up. Is it concerning that a minister personally signed a contract that her own officials challenged? Have you seen this elsewhere?
I'm going to see if Nick wants to add something here, but it's my understanding that the minister did not actually sign the contract. They just provided authority to exceed the limit allowed by the public service. He's nodding in agreement.
That's great.
So.
I'll turn to contract chains now. A practice you discovered is that a small non-competitive contract would be granted to a department as it fell below the threshold that requires a competitive process. Once this contract was awarded, departments would argue that future